In the vastness of the American night, an accident shattered the silence with the metallic clang of twisted metal and shattered glass. A wrecked car lay on the shoulder, smoke rising like a sign of despair, and inside it, an unconscious, bloodied woman, teetering between life and death. A muscular man with a firm posture and a penetrating gaze walked along the dark road. He was the kind of man many feared and others envied, confident, cold, possessing a presence that dominated any room. But upon seeing that scene, something in him broke. It wasn't just a wounded body trapped in the wreckage. It was a destiny crying out for help, a life that would only have a few more minutes if he didn't act. And there, at the intersection of strength and compassion, began a story where karma doesn't forgive. He broke down the twisted door with his bare hands, ignoring the shrapnel tearing at his skin. Blood ran down his strong arms as he pulled the woman out, feeling the shallow breath escape her lips. At that moment, as he laid her on the ground, the distant siren of an ambulance echoed. But there was something stronger in the air, an invisible bond, as if their destinies had intertwined at the very moment of impact. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he sensed that this woman would mark his life forever. What he didn't imagine was that by saving her, he would awaken buried secrets, forbidden passions, and forces that would set them both on a path where every choice would have a price, and the ultimate price would be paid in the face of inevitable karma. If this story already captivated you from the beginning, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and watch it through to the end, because their fate will give you chills. The night was dense and heavy, shrouded in clouds that hid the moon as if to keep secret everything that was about to happen. The wind blew through the trees on the deserted road, dragging dry leaves that moved like restless shadows on the damp asphalt. In that solitude of the night walked a man of imposing presence, each step carrying the strength of someone who had faced silent wars within himself. His defined muscles revealed discipline, but his eyes held a hidden pain, an invisible wound that made him more human than any indestructible appearance. He was not just a strong man. He was someone who had learned to bear the weight of the world in silence. He carried in his past scars of emotional battles, losses he never revealed to anyone, and the conviction that he needed no one to survive. However, that night, destiny was ready to prove that even the strongest cannot escape what is already written. The silence was broken by the distant sound of tires screeching against the asphalt, followed by a metallic rumble that echoed like artificial thunder. His instincts made him turn his head toward the noise, and there, amidst the darkness, he saw smoke rising and the lights of a car still blinking like dying eyes trying to resist the end. The man's heart, accustomed to beating coldly, accelerated in a way he couldn't explain. He ran. His heavy footsteps echoed on the asphalt like drumbeats, and with each passing second, the scene before him became clearer. The car was crushed against a tree, the hood open as if ripped open by invisible claws, and inside was a motionless body. As he approached, he could make out a young woman's face, marred by blood dripping from a cut on her forehead. Her closed eyes conveyed a fragility that contrasted sharply with the violence of the accident. He took a deep breath, as if summoning all the courage that had always sustained him, and felt that this moment wasn't just about saving a life. It was about saving something inside him that had died long ago. His strong fingers touched the hot, twisted bodywork, and he realized he was facing a challenge greater than any weight he had ever lifted, greater than any struggle he had ever fought. It was an encounter forged by chance or karma, and he knew that from then on his life would never be the same. The man who until then believed he walked alone was about to discover that sometimes fate tears away the silence and forces us to hear the cries of another soul asking for help. And that night, on a lost highway in the United States, a man of iron met a broken woman, and together they would begin a story in which pain, passion, and karma would intertwine on a path of no return. The metallic clang still echoed in the night as he approached the wrecked car. The scene was like something out of a nightmare. The broken headlights cast a flickering light on the wet asphalt, reflecting off the blood already beginning to drip from the twisted door. The smell of gasoline mixed with smoke made the air almost unbreathable. He felt his instincts scream inside him. There was no time. Every second could be this woman's last. His calloused hands, accustomed to bearing the weight of the world, slid along the edges of the sharp metal, ignoring the deep scratches that opened new gashes in her skin. He pulled with all his strength, and the bodywork groaned as if resisting salvation. Her body was trapped, leaning against the seatbelt taut like a rope holding her captive between life and death. His heart was pounding, not from fear of failure, but from the strange feeling that it was already written. There was something about that woman he couldn't explain, as if fate had arranged an inevitable encounter. With a muffled cry of effort, he forced the door until finally the metal opened with a violent crack. His hand, firm and warm, touched her cold face, trying to bring her back from an invisible abyss. "Hold on," he murmured softly, as if his words could fight off unconsciousness. Little by little, he managed to free her from the belt, but when he tried to pull her away, he realized one of her legs was trapped between the metalwork. The sight was harrowing. Each attempt to move her elicited a faint, almost imperceptible moan, like a whisper of pain. He looked around, desperate for a solution, and saw only darkness, the emptiness of the road with no witnesses, no help, no time. His muscles tensed like steel cables, and in an act of pure brutality against fate, he shoved the dashboard with his shoulder, making the metal structure creak until it gave way enough to free her. Holding her in his arms, he stepped away from the vehicle, aware that it could explode at any moment. The heat of the gasoline spilling onto the ground was a cruel reminder that the danger wasn't over yet. He laid her down on the damp grass at the side of the road, resting her head on his arm. Her eyes opened for a moment, bleary and confused, and in that brief glance he felt something he couldn't explain, as if she already knew him, as if their souls had crossed paths long before that night. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, like the breath of a candle about to go out. He pressed his hands to the wound on his forehead, ignoring the blood staining his skin. In the distance, the sound of sirens began to cut through the darkness, but to him, each second still felt like an eternity. There, kneeling on the side of the road, her life slipping through his fingers, he realized he was caught up in something far greater than a simple act of heroism. It was as if the universe had chosen that moment to tear him from his solitude and throw him into a battle that involved not only muscles and strength, but also feelings he swore he could not have. The car burst into flames behind them, lighting up the night with a deafening flash. He didn't look away, just held her tighter, as if to protect her from everything, from the fire, from the pain, from the cruel fate. And as the fire devoured the car in which she nearly lost her life, something inside him ignited for the first time in a long time. It wasn't just adrenaline, it was a silent flame, an unspoken promise that he would do anything to keep her from leaving. The red and blue lights reflected on the wet asphalt when the ambulance finally arrived. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but the man didn't release the woman until the last moment, as if believing only his presence could keep her attached to the fragile thread of life. He handed her over to the paramedics with silent reluctance, and his eyes, accustomed to showing nothing, followed every movement, every hurried touch of the trained hands, struggling to keep her breathing. Blood still stained her skin, but he seemed unaware. He was fixated on her shallow breaths, on her chest rising and falling with difficulty, as if the entire world had shrunk to fit in that moment. At the hospital, the dawn crept in like an invisible enemy. The smell of antiseptic, the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway, the metallic creak of gurneys being pushed. He remained standing, motionless, leaning against the cold wall of the waiting room, like a statue carved from flesh and silence. There were no relatives, no friends, only him, a stranger who had appeared at the worst moment of her life. And yet he was there, unable to leave. Every time a nurse passed by, he searched her eyes for some answer, a sign that she would survive. But all he received were quick glances, charged with urgency, as if the battle raging behind those doors was fiercer than any words could convey. He closed his eyes and for a moment allowed himself to remember. Faces from the past flashed through his mind, people he couldn't save, choices that condemned him to the weight of guilt. Life had taught him not to cling, not to form attachments, but now he was faced with a contradiction that consumed him. Why did this woman, whom he didn't even know, make him feel as if his very soul were tied to her fate? It was an inexplicable torment, an invisible knot tightening his chest. Hours passed, as if they were days. At one point a doctor emerged, his expression weary, his brow sweaty. The man's heart raced. He approached, but the words he heard were sharp. "She's lost a lot of blood. We're trying to stabilize her, but we don't know if she'll survive." The world seemed to sway beneath his feet, but he showed no weakness. He simply nodded firmly, as if silently absorbing the blow, vowing to himself that he would not accept another loss, not this time. He sat in one of the hallway chairs, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands covering his face. The pain that escaped silently was suffocating, but with it was something else. An awakening, a certainty that he would do anything to allow that woman to breathe fully again. He didn't know where this need came from, only that it was real, almost physical, as if his very existence depended on her survival. When the emergency room doors finally opened again, and the doctors began rolling the gurney carrying her body covered in tubes and bandages, he immediately stood up. He approached, walking alongside her as they wheeled her into the ICU. His eyes met hers for a brief second. They were half closed, almost extinguished, but in that flash he saw a spark, a fraction of life that still lingered. And it was in that instant that he knew, no matter what lay ahead, he would not leave her alone. The night wasn't over yet, but something inside him had already changed forever. Morning dawned slowly, painting the sky grey, as if even the sun hesitated to break the weight of the previous night. In the hospital, the man remained steadfast, sitting in an uncomfortable chair beside the ICU door. He hadn't slept a wink, but exhaustion hadn't overcome him. His mind was on constant alert, following the rhythm of the machines, the steady sound of the nurse's footsteps, every detail that might indicate a change in her condition. He didn't know her, but he had already created a bond that defied all logic. It was as if, the moment he pulled her back from the brink of death, he had also tied part of his soul to her fate. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, the doctors allowed him in for a few minutes. The ICU environment was cold, marked by the constant flashing of monitors and the smell of strong medications. She lay pale, her disheveled hair plastered to her skin, breathing with the aid of a machine. He approached slowly, as if fearful of upsetting a fragile balance, and stopped beside the bed. For a moment he simply observed. His eyes, so accustomed to the harshness of life, softened at her vulnerability. It was an image that hurt him, and at the same time awakened something unfamiliar, a protective instinct he couldn't ignore. Then, an almost imperceptible movement. Her fingers twitched slightly, as if searching for something in the void. He reacted instinctively, reaching out to grasp hers. The contact was gentle but intense. Her cool skin met the firm warmth of his palm, and in that silent touch, something happened that words could never explain. It was at that moment that she slowly opened her eyes. They were cloudy, heavy, as if carrying the weight of a bad dream. It took a few seconds for her vision to settle on him, and when she finally looked at him, time seemed to stand still. "You—" Her voice was weak, almost a whisper, but enough to make his chest tighten. She hadn't finished the sentence, perhaps she didn't even have the strength to, but her gaze spoke volumes. Gratitude, confusion, and above all, trust. He didn't respond immediately. He simply squeezed her hand lightly, as if silently promising he wouldn't leave her alone. It was at that moment that a nurse entered, asking him to step back so as not to tire the patient. But even as he took a few steps back, his eyes remained fixed on hers, and the invisible thread that had begun to form between them remained unbroken. Over the next few days, that scene repeated itself in almost subtle variations. She drifted between consciousness and deep sleep, always waking confused, but relaxing when she realized he was there, sitting nearby, motionless like a protective shadow. The doctors whispered about his strength, about how crucial he had been in the rescue, but he paid little attention. What really mattered was the fact that every time she opened her eyes, even for a few seconds, she looked for him. The man who for years had avoided any form of attachment now found himself entangled in a bond he hadn't planned. And the most disturbing thing was realizing he didn't want to escape it. He didn't know her full name, didn't know her story, but he felt, deep down, that there was a greater purpose to it all. A purpose that was slowly beginning to reveal itself in the silent glances they exchanged, in the brief touch of their hands, in the seconds when the world around them seemed to disappear. In that hospital room, far from the road where it all began, an inexplicable connection was born, and though neither of them had the courage to admit it, they knew that this connection was no ordinary one. It was intense, forbidden in some way they didn't yet understand, and carried within it the weight of something greater, as if karma had sewn their destinies with invisible threads. The following days brought a tense calm, like the smooth surface of a lake hiding dangerous currents. She woke for longer stretches, her voice hoarse, her eyes trying to bridge the gap between dream and reality. When she finally asked where he was, he answered bluntly, but with a delicacy that clashed with his stone-carved body. She nodded, as if accepting an inevitable fact, and then looked away, resting it on the window, beyond which the American city had already resumed its relentless rhythm. It was in that gesture that he noticed the shadow. It wasn't the fear of dying, it was the fear of being found. An old fear, the kind that can't be cured with stitches and painkillers. One afternoon of light rain, two people appeared in the hallway, their steps too confident for visitors. They weren't wearing police uniforms, but they carried the posture of someone accustomed to command. They asked about her, not about her medical condition, but about the circumstances of the accident. He watched them silently, his jaw firm, his eyes noting details others would ignore, the expensive watch, the hushed phone call, the quick glance at the cameras. As they left, the hallway seemed narrower, and he understood it wasn't curiosity. It was tracking. Later, alone in the room, she asked for the cell phone from the bag the paramedics had saved. Her hands trembled as the screen lit up, revealing deleted notifications that reappeared like ghosts, old messages with sweet promises that had soured into cold threats. "Come back. You owe me an explanation. Don't make me look for you. This ends my way." He didn't ask, but she felt the weight of his gaze and, for the first time, broke the silence. She said a name with the caution of someone breathing fire. He was a well-known man, with a public smile and a private shadow, someone whose photos appeared in donation drives and, behind the scenes, bought silence. A committed man, unable to accept that the clandestine passion he himself had provoked had been ended by her. "I was leaving," she whispered, and in that whisper there was shame and courage mixed. "The accident." She stopped. He added with something burning in his throat, "Maybe it wasn't an accident." She turned her face away as if the window could shield her. By the time he stepped out for air, night had already draped the parking lot with long shadows. She felt the cold rain pelt her face and remembered the details that didn't add up. The parallel marks on the asphalt, as if a larger vehicle had pressed against it. The clean cut in the front tire, which a mechanic would later confess through gritted teeth, looked like a blade. The black SUV he'd noticed on the shoulder, with no visible license plates, that had disappeared before the sirens. Nothing screamed, everything whispered, and yet the whisper was too loud to ignore. The next day, two real detectives showed up. One asked questions with the caution of someone treading a minefield, the other took too many notes. She counted fragments, enough to sketch the edge of danger without touching the center. When she mentioned that man's name, the detectives exchanged a silent look, the kind that says the law has limits, especially when money enters the room before the warrant. After the door closed, she breathed as if relearning to fill her lungs. "I was humiliated," she said, and the word fell between them like heavy rain. She told of dinners at impossible hours, hidden kisses in empty parking lots, promises that only existed in the darkness. And then came the demands, the small cruelties that, added up, became prison. Deleting photos, disappearing from parties, lying to friends. Clandestine love turned into control, and when she refused the final conditions, her wounded pride overflowed with violence. He listened silently, but inside something was shifting like tectonic plates. He saw the complete map, a woman trying to reclaim her own name and a powerful man who mistook rejection for affront. And there, in the middle, was he, the stranger who had plucked her from the wreckage and, without realizing it, also plucked her from a narrative written by others. At dusk, he left the hospital to attend to matters of survival. Clean clothes, strong coffee, a message to the mechanic who had paid too much attention. In a nearby alley, a dark car followed him with the patience of someone who knows how to wait. He walked as if he were oblivious, but the mirrors of a random store returned the confirmation. It wasn't paranoia. In his pocket, a disposable phone he had bought that morning vibrated with a message from a hidden number. "You are brave, or stupid. Stay away." He smiled. It was the smile of someone who has seen threats turn to dust when faced head-on. Still, there was more at stake than his own skin. He returned to the hospital before night fell completely. In the hallway, she slept, her breathing finally even. He leaned his forehead against the door, closed his eyes, and did the most unlikely thing for someone like him. He prayed softly, without method, without pretty words, just a crude request for God to tip the scales a little. When he straightened, he realized that karma silently was already moving. Because every humiliation exacts a toll, and sometimes the one who pays it isn't the one who screams the loudest, but the one who remains standing when everyone expected them to fall. He promised himself not only to protect her, but to restore her to her own name, and every muscle in his body understood that, from that moment on, strength wasn't for lifting weights, it was for lifting destiny. The hours in the hospital became days, and the days a silent routine where time seemed to drag on only to test them. He remained there, sitting in the same corner, like an unwavering guardian, while she regained the color in her face and the strength in her gestures. To anyone else, he looked like just a man caring for a wounded woman. But something else pulsed between them, hidden beneath every furtive glance, every prolonged silence, every breath caught in the narrow space between the bed and the chair. The bond that had been born on the brink of death now blossomed with an intensity neither dared admit. One grey morning she woke to find him sleeping for the first time, his head resting against the wall, his arms crossed as if he were watching even in his dreams. She watched him silently, and realized that this man who seemed made of stone also carried a fragility. The marks on his arms still betrayed the cuts from the night of the accident, but there were also older, invisible scars that she sensed without needing to ask. When he opened his eyes and caught her looking, he quickly looked away, uncomfortable, but the blush on his face betrayed something that no words could confirm. As the days passed, she began to trust him more than anyone else. She spoke in whispers about the feeling of being watched, about the fear that this powerful man would not accept her escape. He listened silently, but the intensity with which his eyes fixed hers was enough to convey a silent promise. As long as he breathed, nothing would happen to her. And it was in this silent protection that the forbidden flame began to ignite. One night, when the hallways were empty and the rain beat against the windows, she asked him to come closer. She wanted to hear his voice, to be sure she wasn't alone in the world. He hesitated but relented. He sat beside her, so close he could feel the fragile warmth emanating from her. Their hands met, and that simple touch carried more intensity than any stolen kiss. It was in that moment that the forbidden revealed itself, not because the attraction was wrong, but because they both knew there were greater forces trying to separate them. She, still fragile, blurted out a confession he hadn't expected. "If you hadn't shown up, I would have accepted that my end was written." His silence was the most powerful response. There was no need to say anything, because his eyes spoke what his mouth dared not. He felt the same way, as if meeting her had rewritten his destiny, as if she were the last shred of humanity remaining within him. But this closeness, however natural, also carried the weight of threat. She was marked by a dangerous past, and he was now part of a plot he hadn't chosen. With every moment of closeness, with every glance filled with repressed desire, the shadow of that man from the past grew denser. And yet, even aware of the risk, they didn't back down. It was as if the universe itself conspired to bring them closer, knowing that this attraction would bring not only tenderness, but also pain. That night, when she finally fell asleep with her hand clasped in his, he remained vigil, staring into the darkness beyond the window. He knew he was crossing a line from which he could not return. Protecting a life was one mission, but giving his heart was another. He, the man who had always walked alone, was now bound to her not by duty, but by desire. And worst of all, This desire tasted bitterly of prohibition. Karma moved silently, and what was born between them, so intense and inevitable, carried the weight of a passion that promised both salvation and destruction. He left the hospital at dusk, as if he needed a breather from the water for a minute, and headed to the shop of the mechanic who had inspected the wreckage of the car. On the grease-stained counter, the man pulled from a drawer a piece of rubber with a cut too thin to be casual. "This wasn't luck," he said, without raising his voice much. There was at the edge of the cut a microscopic metallic glint, the remnants of a blade. The mechanic, familiar with the city's shadows, added only 2 words, filled with fear, disguised as caution. "Big people." As he left, he noticed the reflection of an SUV parked across the street, tinted windows, engine running, the patience of a predator. The driver wore a simple cap, but his hand on the steering wheel displayed a ring with a symbol he knew well, a stylized eagle perched on 3 lines. The past came back to him whole, like a punch to the gut. Years before, when he was still selling his strength to pay bills and silence guilt, he had worked security at a gala event where smiling men toasted noble causes while sending dirty messages under the table. That symbol, the eagle on 3 lines, belonged to a strategic consulting firm that in practice sold silence. He had seen the eagle on discreet jackets, on nameless credentials, on unsigned reports. And one night, he had seen the same eagle on the door of a woman who, like the one he had saved, dared to say no. The request they made of him back then was simple and devastating. Just make her understand her position. He refused and paid for it, with invisible scars and a dismissal that felt more like banishment. He vowed never to cross paths with those people again, never again to set foot where force serves to crush dignity. Now the eagle returned to perch on the shoulder of his destiny. He returned to the hospital with a heavy heart, and when he opened the door, he found his wife sitting, her eyes more awake, but her expression alight with silent anguish. She held a small box returned by the nurses, containing her belongings rescued from the car. Among documents and a broken chain was a black access card with no visible logo, except at just the right angle, the almost invisible relief of an eagle and 3 lines. When he took the card, she went pale, as if recognizing a ghost. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded, and the silence that followed was more eloquent than any explanation. She lowered her eyes and spoke in a low, scratchy voice. She had worked briefly at a philanthropic foundation, linked to the man she had tried to leave, writing reports, forwarding invitations, organizing lists. At first, everything seemed elegant, important, nice to post, until meetings started appearing off the calendar, messages without emails, boxes without receipts. The people of the Eagle were the ones who solved unexpected situations. When she decided to leave and declined his last invitation, a weekend in a remote house where photos were forbidden and witnesses were priced, her phone began ringing in the early hours of the morning with promises that were threats. He listened without interruption until the guilt gnawing at him decided to come out. He told her he'd seen that structure from the inside, that he knew its reach, the lists of numbers, the nameless security guards, the doors that open at the first cry of money. He confessed that one day he'd almost been part of the machinery that would crush her. It was the first time she looked at him as if looking into a mirror and not at a savior. There was admiration, but there was also pain, because the discovery came with the awareness that the danger wasn't generic, it was personal. His past and her present were faces of the same face. From the hallway, a dry sound of synchronized footsteps made them hold their breath. 2 men stood before the glass, displaying badges too common to be real, and a third waited in the shadow of the emergency exit. One of them rapped 2 knuckles on the frame, a code he already knew. "We're close. We know your pace. We don't need to come in." The man took a deep breath and his large hand covered hers on the sheet. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the sealing of an oath. When he looked up, he was no longer just the stranger who had pulled her from the wreckage. He was someone who would have to descend again to the depths he had sworn to abandon, because her name was being used as currency in a market where pride is worth more than lives. The discovery hurt because it opened 2 wounds at once. Hers, from realizing she was marked by people who order faces erased without leaving a trace, and his, from facing the reflection of a past he thought he had buried. In the silence that followed, the question that needed no voice lingered. What now? He understood there was no path without a price. Either he left her to protect her from a distance, believing in chance, or he placed his body and soul as a barrier between her and the eagle. The pain of discovery was also the clarity. Karma had an address, and that address was his. The following dawn, the hospital seemed quieter than ever, as if even the hallways knew something dark was approaching. He sat beside her bed, his head bowed, his hands clasped in a gesture that blended vigil and prayer. As much as her presence conveyed strength, inside there was a conflict tearing him apart. Staying would put them both in danger, but leaving would abandon her to the mercy of enemies who did not forgive weakness. There was no middle ground, and it consumed him like an invisible fire. She woke to find him like that, lost in silence. Her tired eyes searched his, and in that moment there were no masks. She asked weakly if he was thinking of leaving. The question pierced him like a blade. She wanted to say no, that she would never do that, but the truth was too cruel. He knew his presence attracted the attention of those shadows, knew that the scars of the past cannot be erased with promises. The only response he could muster was a deep sigh, followed by a look filled with torment. Yet she understood. And even without strength, she raised her hand to touch his. "If you go, they win," she whispered, the simplicity of the sentence more devastating than any speech. He closed his eyes, feeling the truth hammering at his chest. There was no clean exit, no way to escape unscathed. Protecting that woman meant diving back into the same swamp he'd sworn never to tread again. Hours later, still undecided, he left the hospital in search of answers. In the parking lot, he found a folded note on his car's windshield, written in quick, firm letters. "She's mine. Walk away or end up like her." The words burned like embers. He crumpled the paper until it was crushed between his fingers, and it was in that gesture that he realized he had already made his choice. He couldn't leave her, not after seeing the gleam in her eyes, asking for something he himself couldn't give: security. When he returned to the room, she was awake, her eyes brimming with tears, as if she'd sensed his absence of minutes felt like an eternity. He approached slowly, and this time he didn't shy away from his words. He said he wouldn't leave, that he would stay by her side until the end, whatever the cost. Emotion filled the room. She wept silently, and he, not allowing himself the same luxury, simply wiped her tears with his fingertips, a gesture that seemed at once tender and a farewell to his old life. That night, they sat in silence for long minutes, staring at each other as if seeking courage. The forbidden became inevitable. His hand descended to hers, intertwining their fingers as if sealing an invisible pact. There was no kiss, no declaration, just the solidity of a bond neither of them could deny. And it was in that bond that the choice was cemented. He was no longer there just as a savior, but as part of her destiny. Outside, shadows waited patiently, certain that sooner or later they would have the opportunity to crush that resistance. But inside that room, two souls had just sealed something greater than any threat. The impossible choice had been made, and the price would soon be exacted. The news that she had survived spread through invisible corridors, and with it came an almost imperceptible movement in the city, as if doors without handles had opened in the early hours of the morning. He felt it first in his body, his skin prickling at the precise moment he crossed the hospital parking lot, the sharp intuition of someone who knows the scent of danger before they see it. The message on his disposable cell phone appeared at 3:17 a.m. Two words that sounded like a verdict: final warning. He took a deep breath, descended the service stairs, and stepped out onto the empty street. In that silence, the past walked toward him with calculated steps. A dark SUV pulled out of the shadows, braked at the curb, and before any civilians could come to witness it, three men got out like repeated notes of the same song. The first came to speak, the other two came to measure. He didn't back down. The conversation was short. "We appreciate your heroism, now get lost." What came next wasn't a fight, it was a test. He chose to take the first blows, not out of cowardice but out of calculation. He knew the camera on the broken pole to the right wasn't working, but the one on the clinic building next door recorded everything from an oblique angle. When the third attempted a backstab, he twisted his body with the precision of someone trained to survive, grabbed the attacker's wrist, and twisted until he heard the sharp crack that wounds the ego before the bone. He didn't advance any further. He let them go. He watched the SUV retreat and disappear, leaving a trail of rubber that the wind would soon erase. But not everything would be erased. The clinic camera caught enough. The smoking nurse on the night shift, who had a habit of recording the rain with her cell phone, caught the rest. Karma, patient, began quietly assembling its dossier. In the room, she woke with frightened eyes as if feeling the world shift. He entered with dried blood still on his knuckles, and she read the whole story in the marks she made no effort to hide. The request that came from her mouth was not pretty, only truth. "Don't leave me." He nodded. He explained what he could, hid what he needed. He promised that if they tried to take her by force, the entire hospital would hear. As he spoke, thunder rumbled in the distance. The nighttime storm fell like a curtain, and with it, a sequence of small coincidences took shape. The power surged for a few minutes, and maintenance crews fanned out, opening doors that were normally locked. On the ground floor, a new overzealous security guard wrote down license plates of all the cars that had been parked for more than 15 minutes. At the intersection, a passing trucker, a fan of filming roads, unknowingly recorded the arrival and departure of the same SUV with mirrored windows. The city seemed indifferent, but in the crack between power and chance, an invisible accounting began to add up. Still, his past wouldn't be satisfied with signs. The next morning, he received a cruel summons. "Come alone." The address was a warehouse by the river, a dead avenue, a shed with no name. He went, not out of bravado, but because war sometimes only ends when someone walks into the firing line and forces the enemy to show their face. Inside, he found a perfect representation of what he had always hated. Cold light, concrete, a polite smile from a man in a suit who pronounced solution as if he were saying sentence. The proposal was indecent in its simplicity. They would guarantee her release from the hospital safely, transfer her to another city with assistance, receive a generous settlement to rebuild her life, and all this on the condition that he sign his own absence. He said no, not with a speech but with a silent refusal that caused the first crack in the man in the suit's facade. The humiliation came immediately, calculated. Photos from the night, an old record of a bar fight resurrected by someone who knows how to blow dust, a case fabricated to make him a problem. He listened without defending himself until the word monster crossed the room. He smirked, because monsters, he knew, don't pray at the hospital door. He left with a gnashing soul, but he took with him something that wasn't in their script, the trembling voice of a maintenance worker who, upon seeing him pass, said through gritted teeth that they'd turned off internal cameras for preventative maintenance just at the time of their meeting. He noted the detail on his chest alongside others, the license plate of the service van, the partial number on his badge, the smell of overused disinfectant to mask the musty smell. Back at the hospital, he found 2 police officers at the reception desk, called by an anonymous person to investigate a report of a suspicious presence. He was led outside under curious gazes. One of the officers, trained to look at people, not stories, saw the cuts on his hand and tried to frame him. He didn't react. He handed over documents, explained the basics, pointed to the camera in the clinic next door, and mentioned the smoking nurse by name on her badge. Within minutes, the cold version of power began to crumble before the simple bureaucracy of reality. There were images, there were witnesses, there was recorded rain. He was reluctantly released, but he emerged unharmed. The intended humiliation became an official record against unknown individuals, small, almost invisible victories, victories nonetheless. That night, he understood the universe's message. Strength wasn't enough. Precision was needed. He returned to her with eyes that knew more, hands that trembled less. He counted the minimum, and in doing so he felt that karma, upon its return, wouldn't come as a single instantaneous explosion, but as a tide that rises and recedes until it breaks down the wall. A sequence of mistakes would begin to escape the control of the powerful. A driver will boast too much in the wrong bar. A secretary will send an email from the right device. An aide will forget that every rain has repercussions. He smiled mirthlessly. The past had caught up with him, but he discovered he was no longer alone in facing it. Taking her hand, he realized it wasn't just protection he offered, it was testimony. And witnesses, even when they bleed, drag the truth into the light. The city slept. Amid thunder and sirens, one cycle closed to open another. Those who once ordered cameras to be diverted would begin to be filmed by the only lens that doesn't accept bribes: time. The day dawned heavy, weighed down by low clouds that seemed to compress the horizon. The hospital was no longer just a refuge, but also a stage for surveillance. He felt it the moment he entered the lobby: lingering glances, whispers that ceased as he passed, and the discomfort of being marked as an intruder. The previous night's episode, with the police taking him away for questioning, had spread rumors. The narrative fabricated by the men in suits was beginning to circulate like poison in fast-moving veins. The man who rescued the woman from the accident was also a dangerous man, someone with a record, someone to be feared. Humiliation rose up before him unceremoniously. As he walked down the corridor, he heard the first audible whispers. "It's him. He was detained yesterday. He doesn't seem trustworthy." He didn't react. His eyes didn't waver, and his firm step was the silent response. But deep inside his chest the wound burned. He who had risked his life to pull that woman from the wreckage was now treated as a threat by hands that had never touched blood to save anyone. His pride, however, was not made of sharp words, but of silent stone. And with each step he took, humiliation encountered a wall where its arrows shattered. When she reached the room, she noticed immediately. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, his clenched jaw, the way he avoided speaking. She asked, and he replied with the same firmness as always, "They want to paint me as guilty." Her reaction was unexpected. Still weak, she raised her voice and said she wouldn't allow them to turn the truth into a lie. She held his hand, and for the first time she was the one protecting him, not with force but with the courage of someone who no longer accepted living in fear. But the humiliation wouldn't be satisfied with whispers. That same day, an impromptu press conference was called by the lawyer of the powerful man she had tried to leave. Cameras gathered in the hospital atrium. The press, fueled by strategic leaks, began to question the version of the accident. Questions arose with disguised venom. Could it have been a lover's quarrel? Could he have been involved? Who is this mysterious man now watching the patient? He remained in the background, silent, observing. His blood boiled in his veins, but his silence was more eloquent than any outburst of anger. As the flashbulbs popped and microphones jostled for space, he simply crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on the journalists. And it was with this gesture that, without realizing it, he turned the tables. His image, unwavering amidst the chaos, began to raise more doubts about who was really manipulating the story. At the end of the press conference, a watchful reporter approached him and asked softly, "Aren't you going to defend yourself?" He simply replied, "The truth doesn't need a microphone, it needs time." This simple phrase was captured by a side camera, and the next day it circulated as a counterpoint to the fabricated versions. His silence had become a weapon. In her room, she watched the news with tears in her eyes. "They want to destroy you because they couldn't destroy me," she said, squeezing his hand. He just smiled at the corner of his mouth, that brief smile that wasn't joy, but certainty. She knew the war wouldn't end there. The humiliation was just another layer of the game, but his pride, silent, became a shield. It was no longer just a matter of protecting her, it was also a matter of not allowing the world to lower him to the role others had written for him. And that night, as the hospital returned to silence, interrupted by machines and hurried footsteps, he silently vowed to use every blow he received as a brick to build the downfall of those who persecuted them. Because something greater was at work. Karma was beginning to weigh in, and those who once thought themselves untouchable would soon taste the bitter taste of falling to their knees before that which they believed they controlled. The following night fell over the city like a heavy veil, and in the hospital the air seemed denser, as if every shadow in the corridors were a watchful sentry. He knew the siege was closing in. Strength was not enough, nor was silence. The men who prowled their lives would not rest until they were certain it was forever silenced. It was in this weight of threat that he realized to protect meant to lose, and the sacrifice, inevitable, began to take shape within him like a silent sentence. That morning an envelope was slipped under the door of his home, a place he'd rarely visited since the accident. Inside there were no written threats, just photos, old photos of people who had once been part of his life, faces he thought he'd protected by disappearing from view. There was his elderly mother, a sister who'd never forgiven his absence, even a child, a distant nephew who might not even know who he was. The message was clear. The past he'd tried to erase had been unearthed, and now it was a bargaining chip. Back at the hospital, he watched her sleep. Her breathing, finally steadier, brought a relief that contrasted with the storm raging inside him. For the first time, he seriously considered leaving her, not out of cowardice, but because perhaps her presence was the current dragging everyone down. But as he took a step toward the door, her hand moved in her sleep, reaching out as if holding the invisible. It held him tighter than any iron chain. There was no escape. If he were to pay the price, he would pay with what he held most dear: his freedom, his name, even his own peace. The sacrifice began with subtle gestures. He sought out old contacts, men with questionable pasts who owed her favors, to secure an escape route for her should anything happen. He gave up hard-earned financial reserves, money that was the last reminder of the life he had chosen to live in silence. With a single phone call, he emptied accounts, transferring everything to create a protective shield around her. It was a farewell to the stability he had built with so much effort. But the sacrifice didn't stop with money. There was also the delivery of something even more profound. He sought out the reporter who had caught his words during the press conference. He handed this man a dossier he had kept for years, documents that could implode the very structure of the Eagles company. Evidence collected from his time working as a security guard, meeting records, names that should never have come to light. These papers were his survival letter, his shield against the past. Handing them over was to tear down the last barrier protecting him. But he did so without hesitation, knowing that only then would the network begin to fracture, and perhaps by extension give him a respite. That night, when he returned to the hospital after these movements, he felt lighter and emptier at the same time. She woke and realized something had changed in him. She asked him what was happening, but he simply replied, "I'm making my way. If I fall, you keep going." Her voice trembled and tears welled up, but he didn't give in. Because sacrifice can't be explained, it can only be accomplished. Outside, his enemies already knew he had tampered with things that should never have been touched. Retaliation would not be long in coming. But inside the room, by holding her hand, the man everyone saw as alpha, strong and untouchable, had already made his surrender. Everything that was his was now placed in hers. The sacrifice had begun, and once begun, there was no turning back. The early morning silence was broken by the dry sound of footsteps in the hallway, heavier than those of nurses, more precise than those of hurried doctors. He knew what it meant before he even looked up. The air shifted, and each second carried the weight of an inevitable war. The doors opened and men in dark suits entered unannounced, their presence more eloquent than any words. There were no police, no journalists, only them, the shadow behind society's masks, the masters of what cannot be seen. He stood in front of her bed like a wall of flesh and will. The first voice sounded like a verdict. "You had your chance to leave. Now it's over." And then what was a threat became action. Two of them advanced, and the hospital room became a battlefield. The sound of blows echoed like suppressed thunder, the crash of bodies against furniture, the shatter of a thrown metal tray. He fought not only with physical strength, but with the fury of someone who knew that every second he bought could be her last breath. But the odds were cruel. Against 3-4 trained men, even chiseled muscles gave way. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, his arm throbbed as it twisted, and his body, even accustomed to pain, began to betray its resistance. Still, his eyes never left hers. Each time he fell, he rose again, as if the mere sight of the prone woman pushed him beyond human limits. The fight was brutal, but inevitably unequal. When they finally overpowered him, pushing him to the cold floor, the scene became a spectacle of humiliation. One of them stepped on his injured hand, another lifted his face by his hair, forcing him to look at them. "You're nothing but an obstacle, and obstacles fall." Those words, repeated like a sentence, were harsher than the blows. He felt the weight of defeat crush his bones, along with the physical pain. Even weakened, she tried to get up, her weak voice piercing the air like a bolt of desperation. "Stop! He's not to blame!" Her scream echoed, but to them it was just another piece in the game. The man on the ground, bleeding, understood in that instant that perhaps her sacrifice was in vain. Perhaps all her struggles wouldn't be enough to rescue her from the fate imposed by greater forces. When the attackers retreated, leaving him wounded, slumped like dead weight in the corner of the room, the silence that followed was almost worse than the pain. He could barely breathe, his chest burning with each breath. Through his half-closed eyes, he saw the figure of one of them approach her, lean in, and whisper something he couldn't hear. But he saw her face pale with fear, and it was like a knife thrust into his soul. Seconds later they were gone, leaving behind only chaos, overturned furniture, blood on the floor, and the echo of threat hanging in the air. He tried to get up, but his body wouldn't respond. He felt the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, and for the first time in years, the real weight of helplessness. The fall wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The man who had always believed he could resist anything was there, defeated, humiliated by what mattered most, his inability to protect the one he had sworn to save. Tearfully, she crawled toward him, pressing a makeshift cloth against his most serious wound. "Don't give up," she murmured, but his mind was already sinking into dense shadows, where defeat sounded like a final sentence. Perhaps it had all been in vain. Perhaps karma wasn't leading him toward redemption, but rather to prove that no man, no matter how strong, can prevail alone against a wielding destiny. And as the room fell silent after the storm, he closed his eyes, unsure if he had the strength to open them again. The fall had happened, and before it, all that remained was the hope that the outcome had not yet been written. The cold ceiling lights turned into distorted constellations as he breathed in short gasps, lying on the floor, the metallic taste still burning his tongue. He heard, as if from far away, the beeping of the emergency button, running footsteps, voices overlapping. He felt fingers pressing against his temple, a cold compress, the sound of her monitor accelerating, and the voice that pulled him back to the surface. "Stay with me." It wasn't an order or a request. It was an anchor. He opened his eyes and saw hers shining behind stubborn tears. "Is it over?" he asked, and she shook her head, her lips pale. "It's starting." The men had left like shadows that know escape routes, but they left the same trace, arrogance. What they didn't know is that this time vanity had made too much noise. The new security guard taking license plates had recorded the SUV. The camera in the neonatal ward, ignored by the technicians doing the preventive maintenance, had filmed the hallway the exact moment the shadows entered. The smoking nurse, reflexively, had recorded the end of the mess with her cell phone. And hundreds of blocks away, the watchful reporter received in the middle of the night the dossier he had delivered, along with the new videos, a dirty mosaic that, assembled, formed the eagle over the 3 lines. When dawn broke, local newspapers printed bigger questions than the press releases. The lawyer's press conference, intended to become a verdict, boomeranged. The foundation lost donors before lunch. A prosecutor who owed the reporter an old favor filed for warrants. 2 executioners were arrested trying to leave the city with fake badges, and a third fell because of a foolish vanity. He had posted a photo in a bar hours earlier with his sleeve rolled up enough to reveal the eagle ring in the mirror's reflection. It wasn't cinematic heroism. It was an accounting of small truths repeated until the wall broke. By late afternoon, he managed to sit still, his head throbbing in time with his heart. She studied him like someone reading a difficult map, then took the small box of belongings from under her pillow. She pulled out an old folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. "I owe you this," she said, handing it to him. He unfolded it slowly. It was a note from the reception of a luxury hotel years ago in hurried handwriting. "Exit through the kitchen. They'll surround you in the elevator. S." He frowned, pulling at memories like someone pulling rope from a well. He remembered the night, the public smile and the messages under the table. A girl who didn't come back from the bathroom, the discomfort that grayed her eyebrows. "It was me," she said, lowering her eyes. "At that event. I saw you prevent something worse, but I thought you were part of it. I was the one who called the complaint that got you fired. I wanted to take you away from the place that hurt you, and I hurt you in another way." The silence between them was sacred ground. Yesterday's humiliation had its origins in the decision of someone who thought they were saving the world with a phone call. He took a deep breath, and the pain in his chest didn't come from the blow. It came from the discovery that his fall years before hadn't been a coincidence. It had been a gesture, a crooked gesture, yes, but a gesture of care. And the path that had thrown him onto that dark road that night had passed through that note, that denunciation, that forced exile. Karma, after all, hadn't come to collect. It had come to sow. He rested his forehead against hers, slowly and firmly, as if sealing a paperless agreement. "Thank you," he said, and the word, so brief, sounded improbable in the mouth of a man accustomed to swallowing thanks. "If I had stayed, I would be one of them." She wept with the guilt that was melting away. He wept inside with the weight he was letting go. When the police came to take statements, they found 2 people less burdened than they had been that morning. He described what he needed, pointed to the right cameras, and gave names without a hint of revenge. He asked for nothing more than protection so she could be discharged in peace. The rest he left to the tide. In the hospital chapel, where the smell of disinfectant mingled with that of a burning candle, he did what he would have thought impossible before. He sat, remained still, and answered a question that came from no one visible. "Will you use your strength to crush or to carry?" He took the black card embossed with the eagle from his pocket. He pressed it with his fingers until it snapped and broke into 3 thin sheets. He placed them on the bench, parallel, exactly as he had always seen them. 3 lines, the bird on top. Then, gently, he crossed the smallest one over the others and wordlessly transformed a symbol of power into a small, crooked cross. "I am not theirs," he murmured. He didn't vow revenge, he vowed care. Days later, she walked out of the hospital, leaning on crutches and him. The sky was clear, as if the city had decided for one afternoon to let go of its burden. The news reported arrests, plea bargains, a foundation that had replaced its facade with hoardings. The man in the suit never appeared again. Some say he's gone, others say he's doing business in the shadows. The important thing is that, where there used to be a closed door, there was now too much light to fill the cracks. At the intersection ahead, a truck driver honked and waved 2 fingers, the gesture of someone who recognizes, without knowing names, who pulled a life out of the fire. They continued in silence because sometimes love begins when you learn not to say it. At the first bend, she squeezed his arm and leaned her head on his broad shoulder, and it was there that the final twist happened. Not in the newspaper, not in the courtroom, but in the body of a man who chose to suffer without striking back. Saving her life was also fate's way of saving his from the place where strength becomes currency. And if karma needed a scene to end the story, it chose a simple one. 2 bodies walking slowly down an ordinary sidewalk, with a piece of plastic cut into a cross in their pockets, and a whole world ahead of them to be carried, not crushed. If this story touched you, if at any point you felt your heart race or your eyes well up, then you know. Don't let that feeling die here. Let yours like now, because it shows that stories of faith, pain, and redemption truly matter. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey of intense emotions. Because each new video is an opportunity to relive this impact that only those who have made it this far understand. After all, those who enter stories like this never leave the same, and you won't want to miss out on the next transformation.